Hello, BookTube, and welcome to New Worlds November. This is a BookTube event that I'm taking part in with a bunch of other great co-hosts where we're celebrating science fiction in the year 2021 for the month of November. And we are concentrating this time around on science fiction short stories in all the different forms, all across the world, except that there are prompts that are designed, if you want, to help you navigate, to help you control the unbelievable profusion of science fiction stories that are out there. And the prompt for this week is aliens. But I thought I'm going through Asimov's and Analog and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I'm going through the ones of those three publications that have turned out this year, and going through the various stories. But I've had emails from a number of you saying, well, I don't have any science fiction anthologies, and I want to get one or two, not just for New Worlds November, but just because I'm curious, and science fiction short stories seem like a good way into the genre, but I don't know which ones to get. And since New Worlds November this year is a celebration of science fiction short stories, and since you usually find those in anthologies, I thought I would pause for a minute from Asimov's and Analog and give you a sort of video about anthologies that I can strongly recommend. So I made a list. I want to start off with a batch of conventional anthologies where you hire an editor. That editor has a discrete time frame. Maybe they're looking at something historical. I've intentionally not had these themed in any other way. There have been millions of science fiction anthologies that are themed along a theme of, for instance, some of our prompts: aliens, AI, dystopia, time travel. I intentionally went away from those. Instead, I'm concentrating on big general anthologies, things that will give you a wide array of stories. And that the joy, the service, the function of anthologies is exactly that. It's very seldom that an anthology will be composed in such a beautiful way that it becomes a work of art on its own. Usually what it is a million doors. And you try these doors one by one, and you come out of that anthology knowing, I really like this one, I really like that one, I'm going to pursue those further. Far too often, people who read anthologies and come away with that reaction then mistakenly phrase that reaction as only those things were good and the rest weren't, when really that's not the case at all. Usually that's not the case. Usually it's, well, these two were the ones that spurred further inquiry for me. So I thought I'd start the list with some general science fiction anthologies that I can strongly recommend. They will not let you down. And then we'll move on to specifics after that. So the first one that I want to mention is the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 1, which is historical. It's edited by Robert Silverberg, who is one of the last great living science fiction authors in the world today. Samuel Delany is still alive. Robert Silverberg is still alive. Most of their Titanic compatriots have gone to that great science fiction convention in the sky. But the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 1, is amazingly good. Just a terrific anthology. I don't usually agree. I'm usually very cautious about anthologies that are edited by authors, especially if they end up putting their own work in the anthology. I'm always cautious about that. An editor's job is to look at all of that smorgasbord of possibilities. An author's job is to make enemies of other authors their whole life. So you wonder, if you're getting to an anthology, what you're getting from that author. And Silverberg is certainly not above that kind of factionalism. But the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 1, is terrific anyway. Then the next one is really an editor. It's 3 books, and I'm recommending all 3 of them because of the editor. The editor is David Hartwell, and he did a book called the Hard Science Fiction Revolution. He did a book called Ascent of Wonder, which is about the origin and development of hard science fiction, and he did a book called The Science Fiction Century, a big wodge of a thing that is just fantastic. He has a penchant for hard science fiction, so-called hard science fiction, which is a distinction in the genre of science fiction where the technology gets front and center stage, and also where the writer tries at least a little to hew to some kind of technical verisimilitude, just a little, instead of just offhandedly invoking a faster than light star drive. A hard science fiction author will take you a little bit into the nuts and bolts of how that might work. A figure like Larry Niven, who invents a thing called Ringworld, not as a backdrop for warmly human stories, but as a reason to talk about the technology of Ringworld. Something like that seems to fascinate David Hartwell. And those three anthologies, the hard science fiction renaissance, the Ascent of Wonder, and especially the science fiction anthology, the science fiction century, are amazingly good. All three of them. They're big, but I'm sure that you can find them online. Then the next one that I want to mention, the next anthology, actually is one of those rare anthologies that rises through its own vision, no pun intended, to be a great book on its own. Not just a great series of open doorways to sample different authors, but a great collection on its own. Something that breathes with its own balance, its own sense of identity. And that is Dangerous Visions by Harlan Ellison. Which is another example of a science fiction writer in the role of editor, and yet, although that usually gets my hackles up, and especially with someone like Harlan Ellison, who was just as prone to factional fighting as Robert Silverberg, in this case it works. Absolutely works. Now, there are sequels to Dangerous Visions. There's, again, Dangerous Visions, but Dangerous Visions itself, the original, is well worth your time. I don't know if Dangerous Visions is in print. I've mentioned on this channel many times that science fiction has a lamentable talent for eating its own progenitors, for just not caring about keeping them in print or keeping them accessible or keeping them really snazzy, and we're going to get to that later in this video. So I have no idea if one of the most famous and revered science fiction anthologies of all time is even in print, but I'm sure that copies can be found. It was printed many times. Guess we've gone from yoga to digging. She's just going to dig nonstop in video. Bean, why don't you sit down, baby? You're bouncing the video. Why don't you sit down? Huh? Oh, baby, just sit down. Then we'll move on. She's not going to stop. All right. Here, let me get this out of here. Maybe that will stop things. Maybe you don't have anything to dig. You won't dig. No. The next one that I want to mention is... Nope, she's just continuing to dig. I mentioned David Hartwell, and I mentioned him mainly as an editor. The next one that I want to mention is also someone that I want to mention because I want to stress the editor. The editor in question here is Terry Carr. And Terry Carr was edited a million science fiction anthology volumes, the Universe volumes, the year's best science fiction volumes, the year's best fantasy volumes, over and over again. He did a million of them. And showed, especially in the year's best science fiction volumes, the perfect quality of an editor, which is that you start to be able to trust them. You start to be able to trust them because although not every story that they include in their volumes will be an open door for you, there won't be any closed doors. There won't be any bad stuff. Terry Carr was great. I don't think any of his anthologies are still in print, but you can find them used online or in your used bookstore, and they're worth it. If you see an anthology with Terry Carr's name on it, you can trust it. There will be no clunkers. And he, among all of those things, I don't want to recommend any individual volume of the year's best science fiction or the Universe series or anything like that. Instead, I want to recommend a standalone science fiction anthology that he did called Science Fiction for People Who Hate Science Fiction, which is him picking stories that are very much science fiction. They're not carpetbagger stuff. They're not speculative fiction or anything like that. They are science fiction. But he went through the stories that he'd seen for the last 40 years and specifically picked the ones that were so narratively engaging that even if you don't like science fiction or not used to reading it, they will pull you in. And I don't think there's a story in that collection that doesn't do that. So science fiction for people who hate science fiction, but that's a terrific anthology if you can find it. But Terry Carr is a great editor anyway. Then I will move on from there to another book that I am recommending mainly for the editor. Much like Terry Carr and much like David Hartwell, Gardner Dozois was an editor who you could trust. He did the year's best science fiction, big, generous volumes for 36 years. A long, long line of those volumes, and they are really good. Most of them are well worth having. A shelf of Gardner Dozois' year's best science fiction is well worth having. It'd be a lifetime of reading. You'd never run out of all the stuff because he read everything, and he had a very broad taste. But I didn't want to pick an individual numbered volume of any series that any of these people have done, because David Hartwell has done numbered series as well. So instead, for Gardner Dozois, I picked a conglomeration of two anthologies, The Good Stuff and The New Good Stuff, which was conglomerated into one hardcover called The Good Stuff. And the title is kind of a joking reference to a term that was used by diehard science fiction fans at science fiction conventions, and Gardner Dozois used it himself endlessly. For you've got an anthology or a number of anthologies, but what's the good stuff? What's the stuff in there that is really worth reading, as apart from all the rest of it? So Dozois decided to make a volume that was just the good stuff, and then he made a sequel. He made a follow up, and you'll usually see it as one volume, those two parts. And I'm not saying that it's all to everybody's taste, but the choices there. Dozois was a fantastic editor, so again, you can trust him. Then I'll mention a couple of things that are newer in their pub date, not necessarily in the stuff that they reprint. The first one is The Big Book of Science Fiction by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. Big, fat, green trade paperback, part of a series that Vintage does. And it's 1,500 pages long. It's double column, and they look all over the history of science fiction. It's really, really good. I liked it a lot when I first read it. I think I reviewed it, and the more I've gone back to it, the more I've liked it. And I think the Big Book of Science Fiction is probably the thing that comes closest to being a universal text among the hosts of New Worlds November. I'm pretty sure that most of the hosts have a copy of that book and like it. And some of those hosts are fairly tough to please. So I want to recommend that. That will be in your bookstore. Alone, almost, of all of these things, that will be in your bookstore. You can go in and order a copy of The Big Book of Science Fiction, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. And the last anthology that I want to mention, there are two of them, and they also will be in your bookstores, but they get pricey. The Library of America, a great reprint series of American classics. They did a box set, 2 volumes of classic American science fiction. They reprinted 4 novels, something like that, for that first two-volume box set with fantastic cover artwork all around the box. And, what you get for Library of America, you get the acid-free pages and the sewn binding, the built-in bookmark. And then that was so popular that they did a second one. They did a second box set, advancing the progress of the stories into different decades. Those collections are pricey, but they're very much worth having. They're very, very good. So I thought I would include that as well. And that is another thing that, like the Vandermeer book, is accessible. You can actually get it. Whereas, good luck getting a copy of science fiction for people who hate science fiction. Good luck with that. The last few things that I want to mention aren't anthologies of many authors, but rather collections of the stories of individual authors. And I want to mention these books in an ironic kind of way, because science fiction is all about positing the future, imagining what might happen in the future, good or bad. And for these last 4 books, we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to imagine. We're going to have to engage in speculative fiction, because the volumes that I'm thinking of don't exist. I'm hoping someday they will. What I would like is an 1,100-page paperback, really tough cardstock, original cover artwork by Vincent Tafete, deckled edges, folded flaps, original introduction by some hotshot science fiction writer today. I would like volumes like that. I have volumes like that for other things. I would like one of those volumes for each of the authors that I'm going to name. And the volume would be called Their Collected Short Stories. And that doesn't exist. Now, the first name that I want to mention, I've mentioned before, and there's Robert Reed, who writes all the time. He still works all the time. He's insanely prolific. And his short stories are incredibly good. He shows up in Analog and Asimovs. We will certainly be talking about him in the course of New Worlds November. But I want that volume. And it doesn't exist. And he's still writing. The other 3 that I want to talk about here, as far as I know, are not still writing. And there's never been a volume like what I'm talking about to commemorate how great they were. The first is James Tiptree, who, in my opinion, is probably the greatest science fiction short story writer of them all. And there have been many, many volumes, many, many collections of Tiptree, Warm Worlds and otherwise, Star Songs of an Old Primate, what are Out of the Everywhere? There've been a number. There've been a number of James Tiptree collections. They're all long gone, but they did exist as little paperbacks, as little mass market paperbacks. But what you need is a big volume that has all of them. Put all those books together, every James Tiptree short story. Put them all in one volume. Same thing for Joanna Russ. who, as far as I know, does not have a volume like that and richly deserves one. Her stories, each one of her stories, is a world unto itself. And again, there have been many collections. I jotted down the names of some of them here. The Adventures of Alex, Extraordinary People, The Zanzibar Cat. Somewhere here I have a battered old paperback of The Zanzibar Cat. But I want a big volume that's really pretty. A deluxe volume that you can go into a bookstore and buy, and I don't have one. And also, lastly, Kate Wilhelm, who's the same way. I would call one of her short stories, her short story collections was called Fear is the Cold Black. I think that was the name of it. I would use that as the title of her collected stories, but instead of just that anthology, I would put all of her anthologies together in one huge book. If a British publisher can do that for the short stories of Robert E. Howard's Conan, then they can do it for Joanna Russ or Kate Wilhelm or James Tiptree, for God's sake. If it can be done for Lovecraft, it can be done for these authors, and that would be nice. But although I am speculating on these volumes, I still want to use the opportunity to recommend these authors. I believe that Robert Reed, I don't know what you'd call him, he's in print because he has a story in a magazine, in a newsstand, virtually every month. I'm almost willing to say that there's only one collection of Tiptree that is available. In the paperback version of the Sci-Fi Masterwork series, I think it's the title story is Her Smoke Rose Up Forever. And I'm pretty sure that Joanna Russ and Kate Wilhelm are gone completely. This is an example of what I'm talking about, that science fiction eats its own progeny, so that you'd never know. You'd never know they were out there. But I wanted to mention that because although these big anthologies that I want don't exist, you can still look for these authors, and you won't be disappointed. So I want to wrap up here. I just want to make a video about some anthologies, since we're going to spend the whole month talking about short stories. I will go back after this. I will resume my read-through of the square-bound science fiction periodicals from 2021. And we'll be doing it by theme, so we'll go back to that tomorrow. But I'm going to wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.